Position is explicitly to be said post-philosophic or trans-philosophic. The possibility of a trans-philosophic, post-philosophic, more generally non-philosophic position is based in Marx's view on the assumption that there are no alternatives. If you understand the situation, you see there is only one possibility of change, of action. There are no alternatives, and therefore the question of principles of choice does not arise. And therefore, the first difficulty we have here is this possible. Is not at least the alternative of a destruction of civilization there, to say nothing of the other alternatives which would come out in a more detailed analysis of the situation, as it truly points in one and only one direction. Marx tries to replace the philosophy by the empirical study of society. And this empirical study is, however, not simply empirical, but it is based on a premise. The premise being that the relations of production are the fundamental relations. This, we can say, if you look at it, as we tried to last time, is a dogmatic premise. Marx himself admits in passing the simultaneity of what I call things production and misproduction. And that is in itself fatal to the opposition. We must see later what the reasons for this dogmatism are. But I proceed now. The presupposition of the empirical analysis of society is the primacy of the relations of production. And this in its turn is based on a certain notion of man. In the passage, in the first part of the German ideology, where Marx introduces the basic premise, he says one can distinguish men from the brutes by consciousness, by religion, or by whatever you please. Men themselves begin to distinguish themselves from the brutes as soon as they begin to produce their means of living. That is producing the means of living. That is the difference between men and brutes. And the whole, all the so-called materialistic conception of history simply follows from that. We can also refer to the passage in Das Kapital, to which we have referred. The distinction between men and bees, for the example. Man is distinguished from the bees by the fact that he is a conscious project. Man is the only conscious social being. He is both conscious and social. In other words, in his way, Marx says what Aristotle said. Man is a rational animal. There is somewhere a passage, I don't remember where he repeats the Aristotelian definition of man as a political animal, as a zoon political, without any criticism. So Marx has a definite notion of the essence of man. But at the same time, Marx says, no, man is a historical being, and therefore any essence of man is irrelevant. He doesn't deny that there is an essence of man, that is irrelevant. And this finds its clear expression in the rejection of anything called eternal ideas, of which we have found traces in the Communist Manifesto. Because if there is an essence of man, there would of course be an essential order of human things, something like justice, virtue, or what have you. That is simply denied by Marx. So there is an essence of man, but this essence is irrelevant. So the difficulty appears most simply as that called relativism. The emancipation of the proletariat is not simply the substitution of one class for another. The emancipation of the proletariat is the emancipation of man. I'll read to you a few passages from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which we have not been able to read yet. The proletariat is characterized by universal suffering. It does not claim a special, particular right, because no special injustice is done to it, but injustice simply, the absolute injustice. And the proletariat cannot refer anymore to a historical title, like the British Constitution, but only to the human title, to the human title. The proletariat is characterized by the complete loss of humanity, and therefore it can only recover through the complete recovery of man. The proletariat is the absolute class. The emancipation of the proletariat is the emancipation of man. It's the same context at the end of this work. He says the emancipation of the German is the emancipation of man. The head of this emancipation is philosophy. The heart, the proletariat. When all inner conditions have been fulfilled, the German day of resurrection will be announced by the noises of the French cock, meaning the revolution will actually begin in France. But as day of the resurrection, and it is not merely the resurrection of either the Germans or the proletarians, it is the resurrection of man. There is an absolute difference between the proletariat and any other class. There can be no question of relativism. The proletarian revolution is the revolution and not merely one among many. But how can this be if there are no eternal ideas? How can you to use Marx's expression, eternal ideas? How can there be an absolute class if there are no absolute standards? Otherwise, Marx's expectation from the communist revolution would be merely the specific ideology of the proletariat as one class among many. Now, how does Marx avoid relativism? We can say this: the historical process is not infinite. It has a beginning and an end. A passage to which I have referred before in this, what communism is the return of man. Communism has completed naturalism and a completed humanism. Communism is a true resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. It's a true resolution of the conflict between existence and essence, between objectification and spontaneity, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. Communism is a solved riddle of history and knows itself to be that solution. The riddle of history, which was always unsolved, is now solved and known to be solved. That's Hegel. Marx avoids relativism by fundamentally the Hegelian way. I referred also to the passage where he speaks that communism possesses a consciousness which transcends or surpasses the historical movement. To repeat, it is a Hegelian solution. There can be an absolute class because there is an absolute moment in history. The recovery of man, the resurrection of man. But does Marx have a right to such a Hegelian solution? Hegel had a right. Whether Marx had a right is not a matter. And Hegel had to write fundamentally because of the teleological character of his conception. The historical process is the unfolding of the mind. And this unfolding is a teleological process. The mind always wanted to know itself, desired that. And then it finally reaches this result in the full consciousness of the mind's activity in Hegelian philosophy. I will have to come back to that. I turn to another point, another aspect of the problem of the essence of man or the nature of man. The proletarian revolution means the removal of self-alienation, the removal of the division of labor and private property, the establishment of the society of free and equals without, and the withering away of the state, therefore. The substitution of freedom for everything which has grown by nature, Naturwüchsig in German. The moral regeneration of man. Freedom means the freedom of developing all my capacities, with the knowledge that this freedom of developing all my capacities presupposes the freedom of everyone else to develop his capacities. Such a freedom means that everyone should become a universal man, in the language of Leonardo da Vinci, homo universale, a man who develops all his faculties fully. There is this famous passage which we have not discussed in the first part of the German ideology, which I read to you. In the communist society, society regulates general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do today this, tomorrow that, to go hunting in the morning, to go fishing in the afternoon, to raise cattle in the evening. I mean, why is the evening is a particularly good time for cattle raising? I don't know. To be a critic after luncheon, as I like, as I just happen to like, without ever becoming a hunter, a fisher, a shepherd, or a critic. That, in other words, that's the division of labor means that I have a job. For example, I happen to be a teacher. Someone else is a shoemaker, and other man is a playwright. Everyone is something. But no one is a man, a human being. The taking back of the the qualities into full humanity, that is the human meaning of the overcoming of the division of labor. This notion, Marx would say, that is not an eternal ideal, that's an ideal which could become visible to man only at a certain stage of the historical process. Men we did not strive unconsciously for freedom, thus understood. They were concerned with entirely different things. But once a certain stage of productivity is reached, this is the goal which presents itself to man. So it is historical. Yes, but it is also final. There is no question that this ideal or this goal, this notion of human perfection, however you call it, can ever reasonably be changed in the future. Therefore, we have to look at it. Now, if we read this description of this fishing in the morning, cattle raising in the evening, and after dinner to become a critic and so, we can say, how can we distinguish this universal man of the jack of all trades? Is such a man who does all these things truly superior to the right kind of one-sidedness? What is the use of everyone being a critic instead of doing some work for which he is competent to do? Another illustration is offered by another remark occurring in the same connection. True intellectual, spiritual wealth of the individual depends entirely on the wealth of his actual relations. Through that, the individuals are liberated from the various national and local limitations are put into connection with the production, also the intellectual production, of the whole world. The spiritual, intellectual world of an individual, which Marx regarded, of course, much more highly than his monetary world, it depends entirely on the worlds of his actual relations. Now, these actual relations become enormously enlarged as soon as you have a world market, as you have relations to all parts of the globe, to all kinds of humanity, and this makes you intellectually or spiritually richer. You only have to think of a man like Shakespeare, who lived considerable time before the full emergence of the world market, who never left England, who knew what he knew of antiquity and other places from certain books, and he was probably judicious in selecting these books. He should have less intellectual freedom than a globetrotter of the 20th century? Absurd. This freedom of which Marx speaks here can hardly be described as a desirable one. This ideal can hardly be said to be superior to earlier ideas. Furthermore, do all men in fact have capacities for everything? Is the one-sidedness of most men not natural, and therefore the division of labor not fundamentally natural? Are men all equally gifted? Now, Marx admits the inequality of capacities, as we have seen last time. The capacities differ, in particular the intellectual capacities. But nothing follows from that regarding reward or enjoyment. You remember that. Because from everyone according to his capacities to everyone according to his needs. Now, I will not go into this question, although it is, of course, of the greatest practical importance. It is identical with the question of the incentives, whether most men will make the necessary effort required by society without having incentives other than the development of their capacities. One could raise another question that is admittedly a casual remark, but I found it very interesting, and that occurs in his Critique of Proudhon, The Mystery of Philosophy. Society as a whole has this in common with a factory, that it also has division of labor. If one takes division of labor in a modern factory as an example, in order to apply it to a whole society, then surely that society would be best organized for the production of its wealth, which had only a single entrepreneur as leader, and who would distribute according to a plan the functions among the different members of society. But as you know, the opposite is true. We have anarchy of production. In other words, here seems to be, I do not know how relevant that is for the work of Marx as a whole, but I know it is a fact. Marx mentions occasionally the possibility that the anarchy of production can be avoided only by a social planning, but that this social planning requires itself a hierarchy of planners. And in other words, does even precisely the communist society not even require an inequality? Yet Marx, to come back to the crucial point, the inequality of capacities, Marx is hesitant about it, as would appear from a number of remarks. He develops this in the clearest passage on this subject occur in his writing on economics and philosophy, which is now accessible in an English translation. Partly basing himself on Adam Smith, Marx makes this suggestion. The inequality of capacities, which is empirically undeniable, is the effect rather than the cause of the division of labor. So the inequality of capacity, in other words, is a social product, not a natural datum. Great inequality of capacities is certainly the effect of the division of labor. The division of labor in its turn leads rather to the impoverishment of the activities of the individual. All this would seem to lead to the conclusion that with the abolition of the division of labor, eventually there will be equality of capacities. But does not the inequality have natural roots? Yet, what is the historical process except the conquest of nature, and therefore also to some extent of human nature? But to what extent is the historical process a conquest of human nature, and therefore a conquest also of natural inequality? Marx is unable to give a principle here, and that is a revenge for his contempt about the question of the essence of man. Because if the essence of man remains so wholly indeterminate, how can you then have any principle here? Let us read the clearest passage of Marx on the natural root of the division of labor. With the development of property, the division of labor develops. The division of labor was originally nothing except the division of labor in the sexual act. Here. In other words, that is of course an absolutely fantastic assertion, because if you want to be realistic, you would have to say that this division of labor is not limited to the sexual act. It has to do with procreation as a whole. You know that men do not become pregnant, but women do. But this wholly unreasonable limitation to the sexual act, instead of taking the whole procreation, is a characteristic of the whole procedure. Now, if you think this through, what is the conclusion? If the division of labor is rooted ultimately in the bisexuality of man, this is the primary form, and the division of labor is to be overcome, let's get rid of the bisexuality. Yeah, don't laugh. I mean, it is silly, but it is a very serious problem. And there is, of course, and you know, I'm not speaking of Mr. or Mrs. Jürgensen in particular, but I'm concerned with what people have given some thought throughout the ages to the question of producing human beings in test tubes. You know, the homunculus problem. Well, that is a practically absurd suggestion, that is clear. But we are concerned now, what is the principle which allows us to say that is absurd, and not merely some vague knowledge of what we can do and what cannot do? Marx doesn't have such a principle. But he does not have a notion of the essence of man, which is sufficiently clear. And yet, Marx's position describes itself as humanism. How can there be a humanism if there is no relevant, essential difference between man and brutes, and therefore if there is no relevant essence of man? No humanism without a fixed nature of man, which may undergo any changes, retains its identity within the change. I must here praise our colleague Harold Laswell. When he raised his famous question in his presidential address of the American Political Association, whether we should not give human rights to robots. Do you remember? Because after all, they might do all kinds of computation as any social scientist does, and perhaps better than some social scientists. Then he was in a way more consistent than Marx. Yeah? Because if this is wholly undefined what a human being is, also loosely defined as a being which may do computations, for example, then it is, of course, impossible to draw a clear line between men and I mean, the interest which Marx necessarily arouses is based on the fact that he admits an essential difference between men and brutes. But he has no longer a clear principle to maintain that. The conquest of nature includes victory over man's nature. this has another implication. Who is the victor? Who is the conqueror? If man is changed in this process, man is as much conquered as a conqueror. There must be something in man which is a conqueror, and something other which is a conquered. The clearest formulation is a distinction between the spirit and the non-spirit. In other words, here we see how true it is when Marx says that communism, as he understands it, is a synthesis of spiritualism and materialism. Let me now turn to Marx's moral philosophy in particular. Marx starts from the phenomenon of the modern worker, in contrast, say, to the medieval craftsman. The modern worker does stultifying work for the sake of mere life, mere subsistence, whereas the medieval craftsman did meaningful work. That has been said many times before Marx, and from this some reactionaries drew the conclusion, let's return to the Middle Ages. Marx regards this as impossible, and not only in a very general way, because you cannot turn the wheel of history back, as you say, but Marx says the medieval craftsman himself was not in such a desirable situation. There was also a considerable lack of freedom there and of intellectual limitations there. More generally stated, even there in the medieval craftsman could not find full satisfaction in his work. Even there existed the cleavage of pleasure and of duty. That we can say is the starting point of Marx's reflections. Marx rejects all moral teachings on this ground. Either they teach pleasure or enjoyment, Epicureanism or what have you, or they teach asceticism, duty. And one point is very simple. If you have an ascetic philosophy, that means something entirely different to the man who is compelled to live ascetically because he is poor, as it means to the other one. And still more so in the case of enjoyment. What does the hedonistic teaching mean to someone who is prevented from having any enjoyments of life? One must transcend this whole issue of pleasure and duty. In which way? Duty and labor belong together, of course. Duty, labor, asceticism, self-denial, all this belongs together, and enjoyment of pleasure. And what is that? Creative expression of life is the formula. A satisfying activity which is not as such labor. Even if it is a productive activity, it doesn't have this particular meaning of labor. Labor is connected somehow with pain and self-denial and the other things which Locke so eloquently described. So the solution of the moral problem is transcending moral philosophy and looking forward to mankind who are capable, where everyone is capable of the creative expression of his individuality, of his life, satisfying activity. This is, of course, not transcending moral philosophy. This in itself is merely return to Aristotle. For what is a good life according to Aristotle? It's a life according to virtue. But that does not mean duty in this sense in which Kant has meant it, but it meant to do the work of man, your work as a human being, and to derive enjoyment from this very fact, satisfying activity. Sure, Aristotle spoke of virtuous activity, and Marx speaks of the creative expression of life. What does this mean? For Aristotle, not everyone is capable of virtuous activity, at least not on the full level. Partly because he is by nature unable to do it, partly because of unsatisfactory conditions. What What Marx does in tacit opposition to Aristotle, is to abolish the distinction between the necessary things and the noble things. Virtuous activity is noble, but to earn your livelihood is a necessity. There's nothing noble about that. And Aristotle does not expect a sensible man to find his satisfaction in the mere earning of his livelihood. He might be so fortunate as to earn his livelihood by doing the work of a human being, but that would be really accidental. The mere procuring of the necessities of life is necessary and not noble. Marx denies that. How can he do that? Ultimately, because in the realm of freedom, as distinguished from the realm of necessity, there are no longer necessities. Otherwise the distinction is not fully justified. One can also put it as follows, that's equally correct, that Marx, in opposition to Aristotle, denies that there is a hierarchy of human activity. So let us assume, for example, fishing, hunting, thinking, painting. These are all activities which people can enjoy. You can't say one is a higher and the other is a lower. One can also say that it's only different aspect of the same thing. Marx forgets in this statement about base actions. Because if the possibility of base actions exists, then you admit the necessity of a morality, by virtue of which, of a moral teaching, by virtue of which you distinguish between the noble and base. What Marx implies is that the moral generation of man will be the necessary consequence of the proletarian revolution. There will not be, ultimately, the moral defects and the cowardice, laziness, etc., which we find, can only be understood in terms of the defective social conditions. Once man has come into his own, not only crime, but any kind of lowness, meanness must disappear. I overstate it deliberately. Everyone will become a beautiful soul, a soul which by nature craves the beautiful and noble and nothing else. A withering away of the need for moral effort, not only a withering away of the state. Is this a fantastic implication of the moral of the proletarian revolution? We must never forget. The moral problem can also be stated in these terms. The private good, the good of the individual, and the common good. For Marx, the expression of life is essentially social, expression of a social life. Expression of social. Now, in one sense, that is a simple empirical reality. You see, when you see, for example, the most egoistic people, the people who don't care at all for the common good, as simple criminals. What do they find their enjoyments? That is always determined by the taste of the society in question. They also want to go to the most elegant nightclubs. They want to have the most expensive cars and the kind of thing. So the meaning of an enjoyment is socially determined. We cannot, generally speaking, in every expression of our life, we express somehow the society to which we belong. But this is not what, according to Marx, is the end of the process. What is characteristic of communist society is a complete and conscious socialization of the individual. Complete and conscious. So the problem of duty has disappeared because I necessarily find my satisfaction in being a member of society and acting in accordance with it. Now here the difficulties are rather great. The rather obvious and the most obvious one is what shows the impossibility of a complete reconciliation of the individual and society. The fact of the death of the individual. Marx hardly ever alludes to that. There is a remark here, the death seems to be a harsh victory of the species over the individual, and to contradict the unity of the species in the individual. Marx's answer is this, but the particular individual is only a certain definite social being, and as such mortal, which is only a repetition of what we know already. The counterattack on Marxism, which was made by existentialism, we can say started from the phenomenon of the death of the individual as the clearest sign of the inadequacy of the social solution of the human problem. Let me assess the problem also in the following terms. If we look at the situation without the assumption of Marx, we can see that there could be such a thing as the interest of the proletarian as proletarian. And as Marx would admit, the proletarian as proletarian is not concerned with the development of all faculties of each. He is concerned, at the most, with common ownership of the means of production. And as little work and as attractive work as possible. That we can assume. This, of course, creates immediately this problem. As little work as possible. What about leisure? What about leisure? The famous problem of leisure, TV, etc. With what right does Marx assume that this problem will not arise? That people don't know what to do with their free time? With what right does he assume that this victory of the proletariat will bring about a moral regeneration of man so that the problem of boredom will never come, as it in fact comes? Basically, the difficulty is this, that the union of primacy of material production and the resurrection of man is problematic. Why should man, after having conquered nature by appropriation of the means of production, be concerned with developing all their faculties and not be lazy, etc., etc.? If I'm not mistaken, this difficulty here is underlying not only the disagreement between communists and non-communists, but also the fight between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky still was, just as Lenin, still was very much concerned with the regenerating character of the communist revolution, with the liberating and spontaneous character of the movement, which claimed to be the movement of the large majority on behalf of the large majority. The policies devised by Trotsky were in agreement with that, at least in principle. Therefore, his attitude towards the problem of the peasants was entirely different from that adopted by Stalin, as you know. Trotsky wanted a period of 10-20 years in which the peasants would come to see for themselves that private ownership is not good for them. Stalin didn't see such a necessity for such a respect for spontaneous movements, and Stalin won. And Stalin, one could say, had very good reasons for winning that, because Stalin did not share Trotsky's and Lenin's belief that the revolution of the Western proletariat is just around the corner. And he's looked at the massive dangers threatening him, potentially at least from Germany and so on, and Stalin won the Second World War, which Trotsky would have lost in all probability. So by abandoning the great hopes, the hope for the regeneration of man, Stalin succeeded, and Khrushchev succeeds. And that, I think, is a kind of empirical, not proof, but empirical indication of the problem of Marxism itself. And I think the clear sign for us, what is going on today, incidentally, is that when the famous thaw came in 1953 and so, I always was waiting that the name of Trotsky would be mentioned by Khrushchev. It never was mentioned, and on the contrary, Trotsky is still on the dung, to use the Trotskyian expression, on the dung heap of history. And it serves him right, because as Marx put it, when ideas are divorced from real interests, as he puts it, then they have always made themselves ridiculous. And Trotsky's notion, after the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was due to certain very special reasons, became divorced from the interests of large masses of men. Marx believed that the massive interest of large masses of men will bring them into a situation where they cannot but be morally regenerate. That doesn't exist. You can have a bureaucracy, and a very efficient bureaucracy, which wins wars and disposes of all revolution. That you can have, but that has nothing to do with moral regeneration. And that, I think, is an indirect proof of the necessity of a morality, and therefore also of a moral teaching as such. But to come back to the main point of the argument, I said Marx avoids relativism by borrowing from Hegel the notion that there is such a thing as alienation and the overcoming of alienation. Therefore, a beginning and an end. And that the process is in some ways cyclical. That is in Marx, but there is also the opposite. For the cyclical process, as Hegel meant it, is teleological. Takes a simple example, is the seed leading to the fruit, and again to the seed, again to the fruit. But so that the seed is the less developed thing, and the fruit is the end, if an end which recurs again and again. Marx rejects teleology radically. Let's consider what that means. The common ownership of the means of production and the classless society is not the end of history, predetermined from the beginning, but is the common ownership of the means of production and the classless society is a need of one definite class, the proletariat. Therefore, it is not a mere idea, but something tough. Yeah? But we make another beginning. We start empirically in our analysis of society from what exists now. We see now production is capitalistic, and this leads to these consequences and to this prospect. And this prospect is the communist society. But what about capitalism itself? Capitalism, that was not predetermined in any way, of course. Capitalism is an unintended or unforeseen consequence of feudalism. You had a certain social order which made it possible for serfs to run away to the cities. Become the potential bourgeois of the future is a runaway serf. A runaway slave in classical antiquity was not the origin of a possible future class, and therefore antiquity decayed, whereas feudalism was able to be transformed into the bourgeois society. Capitalism, in other words, is the necessary consequence of feudalism. It is not the end of feudalism. The feudal society, either the rulers or the ruled, didn't dream of capitalism. They did what they did for the reasons apparent to them, which were all ideological, religious, or what have you. But nevertheless, the necessary consequence was the capitalist order. Yes, but still, is it not strange that this meaning, in strict sense, meaningless process, men produce only with a view to immediate ends, the ends which they understand. They build up a whole social order. This whole social order suffers from contradictions. And without anyone really understanding what is going on, the society is destroyed, replaced by another society. This goes on and on and on. And then at a certain point, you have the prospect of man's resurrection. How can, in other words, you have something which you cannot but conceive as the end of the process. And yet this end presents itself as a mere accidental outcome of a mechanically necessary process. Man is now for the first time coming into his own. Otherwise the whole Marxian teaching doesn't make sense. There is no teleology. There cannot be teleology according to Marx, and yet there is a telos. Spoken more popularly, the Marx position is characterized by an unfounded optimism. As I said before, in the case of Hegel, that optimism, if you may use that word, was founded. If history is the development of the mind, it is at least plausible that there should be an end in which the mind is fully developed. But if history is the development of man's productive activity, there is no plausible reason why a certain stage of that infinite development should coincide with the regeneration of man. Marx half accepts the Hegelian scheme without the Hegelian guarantee. I raise again the question, why should common ownership of the means of production, on the present level of productivity of course, be a sufficient condition for the resurrection of man? Why should the liberation from bondage be a sufficient condition for man's making a wise use of that freedom? Oppression is a good enough reason for fighting, for striving for liberation. But it does surely not guarantee a wise use of that freedom. Only if man is by nature striving for a wise use of his freedom, and only if his bondage to nature, and as a consequence of that bondage, his bondage to other men, prevents him from achieving his end, then he truly comes into his own by that liberation, and there is no further question what he will do with the freedom thus achieved. In other words, the whole thing makes change a sense only on a teleological premise. But according to Marx, man does not strive by nature for the full development of all his faculties and the other things. And there is not even a nature of man to speak of, as I have indicated before. Now let me begin to come to my conclusion. Nature is by itself, as he puts it. Let me read to you a few passages from this economic philosophic writings again. Marx speaks of the being through itself of nature and of man. Let's try to understand. Can man be said to be by himself? Must one not raise the question of the origin of man? Now, for the later Marx, that was a foregone conclusion, especially after 1895, after Darwin's book. But let us see what Marx says about this question of the origin of man. here in this early writing. It is easy to say to the individual, as Aristotle has said already, you have been generated by your father and your mother, and an act of the human species has produced in you man. You also see that man owes physically his existence to man. You must not look only at the one side, the infinite progress, according to which you will ask on, but who has generated my father, who is grandfather, etc., etc. You must also consider the circular motion, which is sensually visible in that progress, according to which man repeats himself in the act of generation, and therefore man always remains a subject. It's always man generating man, regardless of what the individuals are. But you will reply to me, this circular motion, granted, you must admit to me the progress which compels me to continue to ask, who has generated the first man and nature altogether? I can give you only this answer. So, your question is a product of abstraction. Ask yourself, how do you come to raise this question? Whether you do not raise your question from a point of view to which I cannot give an answer because the point of view is wrong. Ask yourself whether that progress, namely from to the cause of the first man, is one which exists for a reasonable thinking. When you ask about the creation of nature and of man, you abstract from man and nature. You posit them as not being, and yet you desire that I shall demonstrate to them that they are. This passage is important for more than one reason, but I limit myself to one point which Marx seems to make here. The question of the origin of man does not make sense, that he surely says. And that is interesting. For some time, Marx went so far in trying to conceive of man as self-subsisting, as coeval with being. If he had spoken only of nature, the difficulty would not arise the same way. But he speaks of nature and man in the same breath. It's remarkable. Then he goes on to say, speaking to his questioner, I only ask you about the act of Genesis, just as I asked the anatomist about the genesis of a bone, etc. But for socialistic man, the whole so-called world history is nothing except as a generation of man through human labor, as a becoming of nature for man. Man becomes man through himself. Metaphysically expressed, man is the causa sui, the cause of itself. I don't believe that Marx ever repeated these points, but they show what he wished. Marx wished to make man the absolute being, the highest being. As he explicitly says, man is the highest being for man, but he wanted more. He wanted to make man the highest being. Simply, man is the substance, to use a Hegelian expression. Why is that? Proceeding empirically, we know only men and subhuman beings. We try to understand. We cannot leave it as a mere juxtaposition, men, not subhuman beings. That we are in need of an ultimate unity. But, and that is the implication of Marx, we cannot understand man as derivative from the subhuman. That's a common vulgar naturalism, as you know. Is it not perhaps possible to proceed in the opposite way, to understand the subhuman in the light of man? Another remark from this writing. the human being of nature exists only for social men. For in society, nature exists for him as a bond with man, as an existence of himself for the others and of the others for him. Only in society exists nature as a basis of his own human existence. Only in society is his natural existence, has his natural existence become his human existence, and has nature become man for him. Hence society is a completed essential unity of man with nature, the true resurrection of nature. Why does nature need a resurrection? The carried through and completed naturalism of man and the carried through humanism of nature. Let us try to understand that. Through society, nature becomes man. Man is natural and nature is human. And therefore there is one science which deals with nature and man, as Marx says elsewhere there. But granting that for a moment, are not at least the points of view different? The points of view of a science of man and of a science of nature. I cannot read you all the relevant passages, but at least one, the most striking ones I should read. In German Ideology, Part 1, we read this. The famous unity of man with nature. You know, the famous unity of man with nature, of which the poets have spoken and of which quite a few people have spoken. The famous unity of man with nature has always existed in industry. Not the poet communing with nature at a brook in a forest, but in industry this unity exists. Industry is the actual historical relation of nature to man. Of not the relation of man to nature, but of nature to man. How remarkable. It's the practical expression, or the external expression of this, that the one all-comprehensive science which deals with the two parts of being, man and non-man, is economics. Everything subhuman is essentially material for human life, potentially. And it becomes actually material by industry. As I put it at the beginning of this course, economics is metaphysics, the true science of the whole. We can put it this way: production discovers nature as material for human life, as objects not of contemplation, as a mere theoretical scientist would, but as objects of transformation, as objects of labor. Production dissolves nature into products of man, and there does justice to them. You do not understand the hair properly by looking at it, describing its qualities. If you don't see the hair as a potential food, you do not see the hair sufficiently. And that means to go beyond the theoretical understanding. And that means to have a productive understanding. A productive understanding, now an understanding from the point of view of human production, that is a true natural science, it's a true metaphysics. Because nature becomes human through industry, and thus comes into its own. Because nature becomes human through industry, and thus the unity of being is achieved. the relations of productions are the fundamental fact. In other words, the dogmatism of Marx still remains dogmatism, but it is deeper. It is not a mere assertion about the process of history that in given situations, that generally speaking, the relations of productions are the cause or the key to the political, religious, and artistic ideas of a people, but it is ultimately an attempt to account for the unity of the whole on the premise that man is a highest being. Now we discovered two fundamental difficulties if you look at Marx's philosophy. And the first is the dogmatic historical materialism. And the base of that is the fact that Marx conceives of economics as the metaphysics, the true science of the whole. And the second difficulty, of which I have spoken before, why should the victory of the proletariat be identical with the resurrection of man? Is there a unity between these two propositions, the dogmatic historical materialism, and secondly, the victory of proletariat is the resurrection of man? If the whole becomes human through industry, and therewith man becomes truly human through industry, the victory of the proletariat is man coming into his own. In Marx's thought, man takes the place of the pure mind or the pure spirit of German idealism, as we have seen. That is Marx siding with Feuerbach against Hegel, means exactly this. But there is this difficulty. By virtue of the conquest of nature, the nature of man, or man as a natural being, disintegrates. Only through that disintegration can one get rid of the natural inequality and of the natural distinction between the necessary and the noble things. Now, I have talked very long, but I would like to add my conclusion. Yeah, I think I will be through in 5 minutes. My view of Marx does not mean, of course, that I have not learned very much from Marx, and I hope will still learn much from him. For me, the most important point, the positive point in Marx is this, is his notion of alienation. Meaning his attempt to understand modernity in particular as the period of man's alienation. I think that can be shown that it is so on the basis of an argument which Marx, to my knowledge, never uses. If you look at modern thought at its highest in modern times, modern philosophy begins, according to the textbooks, with Descartes, and Descartes' beginning is the universal doubt. What does universal doubt mean? The whole is alien to man. Alien to man. And man must conquer the whole. He must appropriate it in order to understand it. I mean, you see, incidentally, the link up with the so-called economic things, when Descartes calls man the master and owner of nature. That's only impossible. Now, this view that the whole is alien to man implies an alienation of man himself, man's self-alienation. Because man can no longer understand, he loses his own status by conceiving himself as a stranger in the whole. Alienation implies that there was a state of things in which man was at home in the world, otherwise alienation wouldn't make sense. He was at home in the world as long as he took the whole as given and not as an object of conquest and of construction. This was the original understanding of philosophy, the original understanding of man as man, only apart from philosophy. And the classic expression of that is Greek philosophy. I conclude my remarks with a quotation from Marx about the Greeks that occurs in the introduction, not published by Marx himself, to his Critique of Political Economy. There he speaks of the classic character of Greek, not philosophy, but of Greek poetry. And what does he say there? Marx admits that they are truly, the Greeks are the classics. The Greek, from the point of view of art, Greece is always the model. The difficulty is not to conceive that Greek poetry, Greek art and epic poetry is based on certain social conditions. The difficulty is how can they still be enjoyed by us and remain to some extent the norm and be inimitable, be models which cannot be rivaled, that Marx admits. How come? Answer, there is a childhood or an infancy of the human race. And this infancy, just as in the case of of individuals, that may also be true of the race, of peoples, there are naughty children and precocious children. How do you say? Precocious children, yeah? And all other nations of whom we know, Marx says, were either ill-bred or precocious. Normal children, the Greeks alone, were normal children. And therefore, that is the reason why their charm remains unaltered, because we cannot help thinking as belonging to the mature epoch of mankind, looking back with longing admiration to the infancy of the human race at its highest. That, I think, is simply the question, disregarding altogether Greek philosophy, whether, say, Homer, whom he means when he speaks of the epic, or the other poets, whether their understanding of the human situation was infantile or not perhaps more mature than that of the 19th century, and in particular Marx. As this is all I wanted to say. I'm sorry for the moment. I have not succeeded in what I hope to do, but namely in giving a perfectly lucid, unified account of the basic difficulty of Marx. I could only bring a number of points which I believe are important, but I have not succeeded in getting a full lucid account, and perhaps we can help one another in arriving at this. Yes?
You stress one point particularly, and that is that earlier in your lecture today, and that is that humanism is impossible as long as there is no distinction between man and brute or man and beast. Does this mean that it's impossible to accept theories of evolution, like Darwin's theory of evolution, and still be a humanist?
Yeah, what does it mean possible? You can say there are many millions who think and write that is so. And you can say the conclusion from what is actual to possibility is surely valid. But that is not quite literally true, as you know, because many absurdities have been said. And I think it is, if there is no essential difference, I gave this simple example, which I do not hesitate to repeat. The fourth freedom from want. Roosevelt didn't mean freedom from want for lions and rats. He meant freedom from want for human beings everywhere. Clear-cut distinction. Essential distinction, which we always presuppose in ordinary life. You know, there have been attempts made on the basis of evolution to account for the fact that in spite of all gradualism of species changing, there are also jumps, leaps, essential difference. And for Marx that was not difficult to see, because he had learned from Hegel the simple thing that gradual changes, quantitative changes, may become qualitative changes. Yeah? Shall I give you a simple example of this deep truth? You have hydrogen, you have oxygen, yeah, and you have all kinds of combinations of it. But then you make this combination, and they cease to be gases. They turn into something qualitative different from gases. Liquid. And in many other cases. So the evolution in itself is not incompatible with the admission of essential difference, but the preponderant interpretation of evolution is, of course, incompatible with that. Whether the biologist as such is competent to solve this question is in itself wrong. Yes?
In order to be a humanist, you have to reject the most widely accepted interpretations of evolution.
Yeah, and I believe it won't help you much. Because I think that humanism is, strictly speaking, impossible. Because man cannot be conceived of as a highest being. It's impossible. And if you say, well, man is the highest being for man, that means a lion is the highest being for a lion. That won't help you. And that is, I think, humanism is well, it has, if properly defined in certain contexts, you know, the famous humanists of the 16th century, and there were some other people in other countries in different times, for example, in Germany, around 1800, their humanism had a very defined meaning, and it didn't mean what you say now, or what you imply now, that can be defined. But strictly speaking, I think it is impossible. To put it very simply as follows. Man, this I think we can today assume. Man is not eternal. The human race has come into being. Yeah? And if it can be fully understood in terms of the subhuman, out of which it is said to have come into being, then this subhuman is ultimately the key to everything. That is old-fashioned materialism, or with some fashionable changes. That is at least to begin with the possibility. And equally, the other one that something suprahuman is the key to man. Man cannot be understood through himself. Man is not self-subsisting, to deny explicitly what Marx says. And that I think one must face it.
Then, if that is so, how is it possible to postulate that man has an essential nature? He is not self-subsistent.
Is he not? I mean, first of all, there are characteristic differences between man and the brutes, that you would admit, yeah? Are there?
You could say there are differences in degree. I don't know.
Yes, the question is, all right, that is of course a very common view to say man is the only thing which we can find is that man uses verbal symbols, yeah? As a clear-cut difference. That is often said. But the question is, can the use of so-called verbal symbols and their invention be understood without assuming a radical difference between the human mind and the mind of brutes?
I'm not sure that the answer to that has to be no.
You see, you must not forget one thing. If someone starts from a premise, yeah, and wants to defend it by hook and by crook, he can do all kinds of things. But is it simply reasonable to begin with in such a very provisional discussion as we have here?
I would say maybe not, because experiments with cats, for example, and conditioned reflexes have shown that they react to symbols For example, squares differentiated from circles will cause them to react in a different way. Now, maybe this is a difference in degree between man's reactions.
Yeah, but that, in other words, that would prove that that cat, for example, has the possibility of seeing a difference. Yeah, see that somehow that this a shape or differs from another. That is in Aristotle's language that they have common sense in the Aristotelian sense of the word, which is not our sense. That has nothing to do with the problem of reason. The fact that it is a very massive fact, which is frequently mentioned, that cats fundamentally live now as they lived as long as we have any records of cats, whereas men live differently in different parts of the world and especially in different times. The inventiveness of man is obviously enormously greater, to put it mildly, than of any beast we know.
Yeah, this is so. I can admit this. I use cats as an example of simple reaction. But of course, you may, if you discuss man in relation to apes, or Piltdown man, as they call him, or other men. Piltdown man is bad because that's been shattered. But other anthropological discussions of the link between man and
But that's it. We would simply come to the old question that, taking the Hegelian formula, when you have the switch from quantity to quality, there are borderline cases. Yeah? There are borderline, where it becomes difficult to distinguish. It's the same that exists everywhere. There are spheres in which it's impossible to say that's a plant and that is a brute, and yet that does not make doubtful the fundamental distinction between plants and brutes. We have only to say there is a certain area in which the distinction is not clear. There are always, in every field, extreme cases which are abnormal, defect, however you call them, and the question is whether they can be understood if we do not start from the normal case.
Well, the assumption that borderline is abnormal doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, but you have to give an account of the clear difference between an oak and a lion. And you can also take more homely examples than a lion. And you have to account and try to understand this peculiar motility which the plants, generally speaking, lack. The fact that you have no right to assume that plants have sensations of pain and pleasure, which surely which we observe in the brutes, that's of some importance.
Yeah, I'm not saying that all matter is undifferentiated.
The question concerns then what is the status of the differences. What is the status of the differences? And I believe one cannot consistently in any field of human investigation get along without making a difference between differences of degree and differences of kind.
Granted, a boy is different than a man qualitatively, but you might say that a man is part of the process, is one end of the process of what starts out as a boy. Now, this is a restricted formulation of in theory, you might postulate that there is some essential unity between all matter. That coal is essentially fossils, or once was living being, that energy is essentially conserved. You might make that kind of formulation and still establish gross categories of differences without admitting.
You must not also forget broadly speaking, the differences of species has supported the fact that cats generate cats, dogs generate dogs. In other words, that is not a kind of clear classification Stern classification.
Now what we see is cats generating other things more similar to themselves. I mean, this is essentially what we can say as a result of evidence. But supposedly, some geologists postulate that sea living animals at one stage generated land living animals. Maybe they're incorrect, but this is there are.
Well, you see, but that is yourself distinguished between what we have evidence and what is postulated. Now, we must always begin with what we know. And then and surely we might be compelled to make postulates of some kinds, but then we have to go back to the basis of the postulates, and what is the perspective, what is the cognitive interest in using man to prefer this kind of postulates to other kinds of postulates. One cannot simply accept the whole body of facts plus hypotheses of a science and say this is the authority. This is a starting point for any possible inquiry that we cannot do. I mean, I know that is generally done, but it's frequently done, but I think that is a sign of the fact that science has become what by definition it was never meant to become, namely an authority.
Granted that we must assume a skepticism to scientific postulates, but I think we also must assume a skepticism to a postulate which rejects scientific.
Yeah, sure, but still we must make this crucial. I think we cannot deny the fact that the starting point of all science, namely our understanding of the world in daily life, that we can never lose sight of, that this is the beginning and therefore with also ultimately the end for all intellectual orientation. And in the case of Marx, after we are here now first concerned with Marx, we see this. Marx differs from the now most common view by admitting an essential difference between man and brutes. I read to you again this passage. Man begins to distinguish himself from the brutes by the production, as he puts it. Yeah?
This is not, to me, admitting an essential difference necessarily. It depends what you mean by the term essential difference. It could be that he establishes an arbitrary line, and when man begins to produce things, or when he begins to have certain consciousness.
Yeah, but then he takes the other passage in this Capital, where he confronts the building of a beehive and the building of a house, and says there's a radical difference between the building which animals do and human building as one specification of that. I think one can, Marx's whole doctrine, I think, is unintelligible if there is no essential difference between men and brutes.
I don't see that it is unintelligible.
How would you do that? What then does it mean that man is the highest being for man? I mean, what does it mean? There is a clear gulf between man and non-man when you say that.
A gulf even between the boy and the man.
No.
Exists.
No, a boy is a potential adult. I mean, if he doesn't die, he will become a man, and we treat boys not as we treat puppies and kittens. I mean, that's perfectly clear. A boy is a human being, a newborn baby is not a human being as much as a grown-up man, but not yet fully developed. But you can take a puppy and you can take a grown-up dog that is in no way a potential human being.
I may say that the ape is really essentially the same as I am if I trace myself all the way back. But yet this does not mean that I have to have affection for the ape.
Yeah, but can you really say, in any serious sense, the ape is a potential human being? I mean, to say nothing of the famous difficulties that the precise possible ancestor of man has never been, there are great difficulties all the time, up to the present day. But I refer only to one point. Your whole position presupposes that the jumping from the transformation of quantity into quality is irrelevant. And for Marx it is very relevant. That I think satisfies. And the interesting difficulty in Marx is this, that he somehow hesitates, but hesitates between these two views, and not on your ground, but rather on the other ground, because he doesn't want to have, the ultimate idea is this, I think. If you have a fixed human nature, that is a conservative principle to express it. For example, if there is a clear, you have the difference between men and women. And the traditional view is therefore the function of man is different from that of woman, not only as far as procreation is concerned, but also as a woman has to, her place is within the household, and the place of the man is the marketplace. This kind of thing which Aristotle speaks about. Every fixity of this kind seems to establish a principle of the stationary, of the conservative. And Marx wants to have an open horizon for all kinds of progress. That, I think, is a motive why Marx is so uncomfortable with the developed doctrine of the essence of man. It is not this theoretical problem, I think. And one may even, it would be an interesting question to see how far this concern with progress of man is not underlying much of the seemingly purely theoretical difficulties we have in the sciences. It would be also an interesting question. Otherwise.
On the question of the relation between history, the historical forces and ideas, would you say that it could be maintained that the appeal of different ideas at different times can be traced to a considerable extent to the modes of production? For example, say the appeal of a future life times conspiracy to the development of technology, the possibility of different kind of life here, the decrease of the appeal of this kind of thought, or to take another example, say the appeal of existentialism under different historical circumstances in different parts of the world, different times.
Yeah, why not? I mean, that always depends on special investigation of the situation. That is not the question. The question is whether the relations of production are the ultimate key to such intellectual fashions, let me say. That's the question. And one cannot leave it at very general remarks. For example, according to a very widespread view, the Old Testament is rather free from a belief in the immortality of the soul. Yeah? I know that not everyone admits that, but the prevalent view among modern biblical scholars is that. Is this correct? Good. Well, could you say that the Jews in the biblical time, so between 1500 and 500 BC, were in a particularly happy situation, so they did not have to think of an afterlife? I mean, every turn of the foreign policy situation between Mesopotamia and Egypt brought misery. And so, but they apparently didn't think of that. So that doesn't seem to be as simple as that. I don't believe that, for example, Max Weber wrote an interesting book on the sociology of biblical Judaism in the third volume of his Sociology of Religion. And he brought out some very interesting things which I believe no one has ever considered. Namely, what was the social stratification of old Israel? Yeah? And quite a few terms which have been translated traditionally without any understanding. Gibor Chayil, I don't know what the usual English translation of that is. A brave hero or something of this kind was a German translation, which I remember. And Weber was able to show that this is a very definite social category. It means something like a squire who can equip himself for cavalry service. Yeah? It's not of any great importance for the understanding of the Bible, but still this particular part of the social order of old Israel became somewhat clearer that you can do. But that you can understand the emergence of prophetism, the peculiar prophetism of Israel out of the social and the relations of production prevailing in Israel, seems to me a mere assertion without any evidence. Perhaps there are things where an explanation is not possible. In the case of the Greeks, people speak sometimes of the Greek miracle. Well, that may be an unscientific expression, but I have never heard a scientific explanation in terms of relations of production or geography or what have you, which really explain it, why this science and poetry has this particular very high development in this part of the world at this time. Yes.
Are you reducing Marx here to an economic materialist position? Or is there no distinction between historical materialism and economic materialism?
No, yeah, but what would you say is the difference?
Well, I would think that the difference would be a superstructure in Marx.
For sure. Yeah, but ultimately, that is the point. That is the beautiful ambiguity. But what does it mean? There is an action and reaction between the superstructure and the infrastructure. With what right do you say that is the basic thing? That's the question. If you can empirically observe only an influence of the relations of production on the so-called ideas and an influence of the ideas on the infrastructure, and you have to leave it at that. That is what bourgeois social science does. But what is then the meaning of the assertion? This is ultimately the key. That would be the question. I think one cannot begin to understand history if one does not assume that man is a being which is simultaneously thing producing and ideas producing. Which is in a given case more important than the other, that is, I think, cannot really be decided, because it is very different in different individuals. From the point of view of the economic interpretation of what Marx basically means, it would of course be the society as a productive association as a whole. But in the case of ideas are not produced by many people, if I may use this awful word, like ideas and so, are not produced by many, they are produced by individuals, by rare individuals much more. And when Marx gives these examples of the simultaneous discoveries, Newton and Leibniz, the calculus, and some later examples where there were even 4 or 5 men who made the discovery at the same time, but that is really a very recent phenomenon. And whether in the olden times there was, as far as the great discoveries or inventions were concerned, that could be traced to a single individual, and that the invention of the idea was made because there was a previous need for it, is a mere assertion. The invention may have created the need. I mean, Marx is simply not empirical enough there. I know of no case in which it is useful for the understanding of a doctrine to refer to the conditions, to the relations of production as such, as helpful for the understanding of the doctrine. It may be so to a certain extent in certain secondary things in the 19th and 20th century, but in the case of economic doctrines, that goes without saying, because economic doctrines deal with the relations of production and will look at them. But in other cases, I don't know a single example. I mean, if you take parties representing the interests of large-scale industry, or farmers, or workers, or what have you, that these party demands which reflect the interests of the groups behind them, it's trivial. I mean, it's not a serious assertion, because everyone knows that. If you take, for example, the case of the importance of the fight against the inability and the more educated part of the middle classes. I say middle class, not bourgeoisie, because it would still need a proof that they can be subsumed. I mean, the commoners, who had high public office and or were professors or writers and this kind of thing, that they resented the arrogance of a decayed nobility, and this plays a certain role. For example, in German classical literature is undeniable. But that is not yet, it would be perfectly compatible with the political interpretation of the whole thing, does not yet require interpretation in terms of the relations of production. And to say nothing of, I mean, on the level of the most common discussion, you have two great poets at the same time who have similar views regarding society even, and you may say, well, according to Marx himself, you cannot trace, because his own case, in the case of Engels, shows that there are switches from one class to the other, at least as far as the outlook is concerned. But how will you explain the individual differences? How will you explain the difference between Aristotle's and Plato's teaching by saying Plato was a descendant from one of the oldest families in Athens, and Aristotle came from northern Greece? What would be of not the slightest help? Or Plato's account of Socrates, Xenophon's account of Socrates, Plato belonged to the nobility, Xenophon to the knights, the class of knights, in Athens. Of no help whatever. Surely then, as a more sophisticated Marxist will say, we are not vulgar Marxists. I mean, we do not believe such a simple correlation. All right, then they should show us in a sophisticated way the connection. And I have not seen that. Relations of production, as Marx called it, play a role for society as a whole, goes without saying. But that in itself was not a new discovery. I mean, Aristotle's politics is full of that. The question is only whether they are the key. That is an answer, the ultimate key. That's the answer question. But Mr. Cox, you have to talk to him.
I think that's how I think these things up next time.
I see. You come on. Now, is there anyone else who would like to bring up something? Mr. Gilden?
Just one question. Does something under history being the history of the relation of nature to man? Does the same problem that arose with the regeneration of mankind, that is a goal and that it can be a goal, also arise in the relation of nature to man, that man is a goal of nature, and that man can be a goal of nature?
Yeah, sure. Because of the rejection of teleology. There cannot be an end. I mean, that is clear. One can say that the general characteristic of the modern development is to get rid of teleology. And to get rid of all teleology, to give an account of everything, including human history, in non-economic terms, in non-teleological terms. And